the Instructor Podcast with Terry Cook, talking with leaders, innovators, experts and game changers about what drives them.
Welcome to the Instructor Podcast. This is a show that helps you become an even more awesome driving instructor. And as always, I am your splendid host, Terry Cook. I'm delighted to be here, even more delighted that you have chosen to listen, because you are listening to Season 7, which is sponsored by Bright Coaching. So head over to brightcoaching.net and sign up to their newsletter to make sure you keep updated with all the latest news and events available at Bright Coaching. But Season 7 is also themed, and this season we are looking at road safety. And today in particular, we are looking at distracted driving, because I am joined by Professor Gemma Briggs, and we're talking all things distracted driving, mobile phone use, hands-free use, and in particular, why hands-free is just as dangerous as using an actual handheld device. So loads of useful insights today, including, again, some resources that you can make the most of. So make sure you are listening with a pen and paper handy to make some notes. But just before we crack on with the episode, I want to ask you to click subscribe. Wherever you're listening, go and click subscribe so it drops into your feed whenever we release an episode, including those mid-month bonus episodes that we do. It's also the best way for you to help share the show. By clicking subscribe, it makes it more discoverable on all your podcast apps. So whether you're listening on Apple or Spotify or even YouTube, make sure you're clicking subscribe. But for now, let's get stuck into the show. So we're now joined by the Head of Discipline and Professor of Applied Cognitive Psychology at the Open University, Professor Gemma Briggs. How are we doing, Gemma?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me along.
No, delighted to have you on board, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into this and talking about distracted driving, the different kind of facets around that, and potentially even what we can do as instructors to, eliminate that or at least reduce it. But I'm thinking about how to start off this interview, and I felt like the best question I've come up with was, should driving instructors be listening to this podcast while they're driving?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the answer is anything that you do whilst driving, other than driving, has the potential to distract you. Of course it does. But what I would say is listening to podcasts like this one, or radio plays, or even just news items that might wind you up a little bit, while they can be distracting and they can take your mind partially away from the task of driving, what they don't do is require engagement from you, active engagement. So yes, you might shout at the radio. Hopefully no one would shout at the podcast. But, you've got that level of engagement, but you're not required to respond in like a timely manner, like you are if you're using a phone to send a message or have a conversation. So yes, it can be distracting, but having studied this for 17, 18 years in terms of driver distraction, I wouldn't say listening to a podcast is a major problem.
I think there's definitely been a few episodes that people have shouted at over the years, but do you think, is it also, I suppose, that you can switch it off? You're in full control, aren't you, with that? So if the common one I can think of is if you're looking for somewhere, an address or something, you can turn the radio down because you need to concentrate. So does that play a part as well?
Exactly right. So if you face something challenging in your driving situation and you're listening to something, even if you're really absorbed in that, chances are you'll shift your attention entirely to that driving thing that needs your attention. And you'll just zone out of the other thing. And then you'll find that you might zone back in and suddenly think, oh, I've missed that. I don't know what's happened there. So that's a really important difference, because of course, if you zone out of a phone conversation and someone's on the other end of the phone waiting for you, they're going to drag your attention back if you zone out by saying, are you still there? And then your attention's taken back away from that driving task. So it's all about that interactivity.
So looking at this field of distracted driving, am I right in thinking you've been working in this area for about 15 years or so?
Yeah, just slightly over. Yeah, around that. Let's say just sub 20 years.
Is the problem getting worse? Is it the same? Have you noticed any changes like that? Or
it's definitely a big problem, but it depends about what type of phone use we're talking about. Because of course, there's the illegal type and there's the legal type. So handheld or hands-free. We've got a reasonable measure of how many people use their phones handheld, so illegally behind the wheel. We know that around about a quarter of drivers admit to doing that, even though it's against the law. We don't really have a great measure of how many people use their phones legally, hands-free. There's some estimates that maybe up to 50% of drivers, but we don't really know because we don't measure it. So it's certainly, I would say, got worse as smartphone technology has got better. And laws can't keep up with the pace of technology because you can do more with your phone now than you could in 2003 when the first mobile phone laws came in. So it's hard to answer that question really, but I think anyone who walks down any street as a pedestrian and walks past a queue of traffic will have experience seeing someone using their phone, whether that be handheld or hands-free. It's really common to see. So I think based on the data that we've got and subjective experience, yes, it's a big problem.
I mean, one of the things I find scary, you said about seeing people using their phone while they're driving, is how long they're looking down for. And it's that, I reckon that they probably think they're looking down for a second, but it can be like 5 or 6 seconds sometimes. Do people not realise how long they're taking their eyes off the road for?
I don't think they do. And I think it's all absorbing because it's all to do with how you apply your attention. So people think they can have a quick look down at their phone and then flick the eyes back up. And you see people using their phones doing just that. But they're missing information in that time as they're shifting their eyes and shifting their attention. They think that they're kind of dividing their attention in that way, but they're not. They're shifting it entirely to that phone task, whether it's looking at the screen, sending a message, whatever. And then they're shifting their focus back up to look out of the windscreen. But it's even worse than that because your attention doesn't shift that quickly. So you've got this lag, this what we call a resumption lag when you shift between tasks. So you might be pointing your eyes back out the windscreen, but in that second or so, you're not actually taking in any information. So you've got multiple problems. Yes, they're definitely looking away for longer than they think they are. But even when they're looking out of the windscreen immediately after having looked away at their phone, they're not actually taking in information.
I mean, I want to come back to some of that in a second, but I feel that I should make a confession now because I'd forgotten this until we started talking. So I'm looking back sort of 18 years and I once got pulled for using my phone while driving. This was way before I was an instructor. I was probably about 19, 20 at the time. And the thing that made me stop using it was the fact that I got pulled because I can remember driving around in circles trying to find this place. I couldn't find it. I pulled up at the side of the road. I rang my dad because he knew where it was, told me where it was. So I drove around again, couldn't find it, pulled up, rang him again. So I did like 2 or 3 times. And then I got bored of pulling up. So I rang him while I was at a set of lights. Police car behind me. But because I'm paying more attention to my phone, I've not even noticed a police car behind me. And that was a massive shake-up to me. It was like, do you think sometimes people, how can I phrase this? We need that kick up the backside to realise that. And do you think part of our role is to give people that kick up the backside sometimes?
Yeah, definitely. So experiencing your own distraction for yourself is something I talk about a lot as the driver in changing behaviour. Hopefully first changing attitudes and then changing behaviour. So simply telling people, it's really dangerous to do this. It's really dangerous to look at your phone. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows the dangers. But until you experience it for yourself, I think it's really difficult to change behaviour just by telling them. So yeah, absolutely. There is a role to be played, not just by driving instructors, but by the wider road safety community. And I think we can do a lot better than we currently do. There's lots of fantastic work that goes on out there to try and educate people about the dangers. But we need to be a bit savvy about it. I think we need to be clever and we need to make it innovative and engaging so that people really buy into it and they really understand.
I mean, one of the things I do in CAN, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this actually, because you mentioned before about once you've used the phone, there's sometimes like a lag afterwards. When I see a learner, they'll make a mistake, could be any mistake, and then they'll drive on. And for the next 30 seconds or minute, they'll be thinking about that mistake. And something else will go wrong, potentially bigger, and I might even have to intervene at some point. So we can pull up and talk about it. And I'll use that as an example to talk about a mobile phone and say, if you're that distracted by that thing that happened 30 seconds ago, how distracted will you be by mobile phone? Do you think that's potentially a good example, a good opportunity we could use? Because we can't let them use the phone while they're driving to see what it's like.
Yeah, that's a really nice example. So you're absolutely right. So after you've used a phone, whether it be handheld or hands-free, you're still at an increased crash risk. You're 4 times more likely to be involved in a collision if you're using a mobile phone and for 5 minutes after using a mobile phone, regardless of whether you're physically holding it. And that's because it's all about cognitive distraction. So it's exactly the same thing. So you're talking about your students who have become distracted by kind of ruminating or panicking or having a rush of adrenaline about something that they've just done wrong or something that's just happened. And yeah, their brains are using lots of their attention to think about that, to focus on that. That's cognitive distraction. It's a different form of distraction, but in terms of it being caused by, an event rather than a phone conversation. But it's a really nice demonstration because it shows that you really have to have your mind focused on driving, that you don't really have spare capacity to be doing other things, because in a driving situation, things can change really quickly and you need to be able to react.
Yeah. Good to feel like I'm doing something right there. So that's good.
Definitely are.
I do want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, because you spoke about like a quarter of drivers said that they use the phone illegally or have used the phone illegally. And I find that number quite scary, probably bigger than I actually thought it would have been. But I also think that's a number of people that are admitting to it. So is that number probably bigger than that?
It most probably is. It's most probably an underestimation. And it's the same for things like collision statistics. I think the data that we have are hugely problematic and likely underrepresent the problem. I mean, but it is the best measure we've got at the moment, self-report, for these kind of things. So, I mean, that 25% figure came from the RAC report on motoring, which is, of course, the annual survey and report. But, that's the average. If you look at the breakdown, 49% of drivers aged 17 to 24 admitted to phone use, which is staggering, and 33% of drivers aged 25 to 44. So it's not just a problem of young drivers, it's a problem of established drivers, experienced drivers doing it too. But yeah, I suspect there are far more people who do it, who don't admit to it, or who don't participate in these kind of surveys.
Yeah. Do you have any information as to the reasons why? Because I would hazard a guess it's different from age group to age group. I'd imagine it more experienced drivers kind of think, oh, I've been driving for years, I've got quick reflexes, whereas maybe the younger ones, it's potentially like they feel like they need to text their friend or something like that.
Yeah, there's different research into different demographic groups of drivers. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. So for younger drivers in particular, who tend to be learner drivers, but not exclusively, but younger drivers have often grown up with a smartphone in their hand, feel the need to be available and contactable all of the time. And there's a huge amount of social pressure, social norms around using phones, keeping up and keeping on, and, not having fear of missing out, no FOMO. So that's a huge pressure there. And that could explain higher levels there. It could also be explained in that age group by greater risk taking. And I know that you've spoken to Dr. Elizabeth Botts in the past about, young drivers and neural development and things like that, which is a fascinating area. So there could be a tendency amongst younger drivers to take more risks, and that could explain some of that. And your slightly older age group, yes, probably represents in the large part a workforce, working parents who again feel the need to keep up and keep on, be available all the time for work or whatever between meetings. So yeah, there are some differences, but I think generally speaking, the issue with phone use is that it's become the norm. It's become an expectation. Sometimes it's an expectation you delivered from a workplace, but other times it's just an expectation that everyone else does it. So what's the problem?
I was pondering this the other day actually, and I was 18 when I got my first phone. I'm 41 now, so I experienced that period of time without a phone where it wasn't there. But the 17-year-olds, and I suppose even beyond that are coming to me now, they've never not had a phone or never not been around a phone. So there must be an element there of this is just their life. Why wouldn't they use a phone while they were driving?
Yeah, exactly. What came first, the smartphone or the car? Yeah, it's exactly that. And if it's so socially acceptable and it's so normal to have a device on you all the time, and we all have them, but if you've grown up with it, you can kind of understand how it's potentially difficult to separate yourself from that. I'm the same generation as you. I learned to drive before I had a mobile phone. And yeah, arguably perhaps it's easier to remember that and think about the difference. Although, having said that, our age group aren't doing brilliantly in those statistics. There's still 33% of that age group doing the wrong thing. So, yeah.
You ever, as someone like yourself that's worked in this field for such a long time and seen some of the devastating consequences of using your phone or any form of distracted driving, do you ever still feel the urge? Like if you've got, I'm sure you might switch your phone off, whatever, but when you drive, do you feel that urge? Oh, I should text so and so. Do you know what I mean? Obviously, you don't, but do you ever get that pull? Because I still do sometimes.
I don't, but I think that's because I'm so vehemently against it that it's so kind of ingrained in me. So I don't. And I guess it's easier because I've never done it. So when I came to first studying this as an undergraduate student and then a PhD student, obviously I had a phone at that stage, but I'd never used my phone whilst driving. So I didn't have to unlearn anything once I'd learned about all this research. What I will say is my kids have phones and they link them to my car so that they can play music when they're in the car with me. And I find it incredibly frustrating because, suddenly a text message comes through and I don't want to hear this. I don't want to be distracted by your messaging. So I do understand. And also I do understand the draw for other people to use their phones. I'm not kind of holier than thou. It's absolutely appalling and no one should be doing it. I think I understand that people feel the need, and I understand particularly in terms of hands-free phone use that it's legal. So why shouldn't people do it? Why should there be a problem with that? And that's why it's really important to do stuff like this and talk about the research.
I think for me, it's like the example I'll give is there was early on this year, there was a post on Facebook saying, "What are your New Year's resolution?" Now, this is 11 p.m. at night, and my response was not to go on my phone after 10 p.m. at night. And I think that's what it is. I get that urge, don't go on TikTok at a certain time, and, you shouldn't be doing this now. And I think it's that when you're driving, you get that sudden thought of, "We'll do this." But I have that self-restraint, that control of, well, A, it's stupid. I've proven to myself it's stupid in the past, and I know it's stupid and I know it's dangerous, but I think a lot of people don't. And why do you think people think they can use their phone and get away with it, if you like, while they drive? I don't mean legally get away with it. I mean, get away without any consequences.
There's a really good reason why people do it, and at the same time claim that other people shouldn't do it. And that's because all drivers suffer from what we call self-enhancement bias. So I say all drivers, most drivers, the vast majority of drivers. So if you take any group of drivers and you survey them and you say, rate your driving ability on a scale of 0 to 100. I've done this so many times. I do it in live talks when I've got a couple of hundred people. I did it a couple of weeks ago with some newly qualified drivers, and it's always the same. It comes out around 80%. So most drivers consider themselves to be above average at driving. And this is an issue because some drivers will be average, naturally. Some drivers will be below average, but no one really believes that they are average or below average. And this explains why many drivers feel that means they can do other things. They've got this increased skill, which kind of mitigates for any other risks. And that enables them to be in this weird kind of situation, this kind of dissonant situation where they're like, I completely support the law in relation to handheld mobile phone use. There's never any excuse for handheld mobile phone use. In the RSC report for motoring, 85% of respondents said there's never any excuse to use your mobile phone behind the wheel. Yeah, we know that large numbers of people are still doing it. And the reason they can do that is because they're talking about other drivers and how other drivers should behave, not the individual driver themselves. So there's this tension between supporting the law and saying, yeah, but not me, because I'm above average. Everyone else should obey the law, but not me. And I think that's why people will continue to do it. And that's why we need to be really creative in how we get the message across that it really is a problem. And that if you are using your phone in any way, you are part of the problem.
I think it was Michael Gove on it that said recently that every student should be above average in maths. I'm like, yeah, I don't think that works. But I think that's interesting because that relates back to something else I'd spoken recently. I think it was with Rebecca Morris. She'd spoken about Idris Elba getting involved in the knife campaign or the anti-knife campaign in London. And one of the things I was thinking about as a result of that is everyone's going to back that campaign to reduce knife crime because it's really easy not to stab someone. You know, I'm literally doing it right now. There's no one being stabbed at this moment in this house. But if I have to put that onto my driving, I have to reflect on my driving, don't I? So, you know, I suppose it's like that. It's we have to admit we're not good enough to use our phones. Is that part of it as well? Having to actually own up and say we're not good enough?
That could be one approach. I think that won't work though, because I think there's such a kind of a shield, if you like, of self-enhancement bias that we all seem to naturally have. Like I said, a load of learner drivers and newly qualified drivers that I surveyed a few weeks ago, you know, rated their driving ability in the same way as most other driving populations. So you arrive at that self-enhancement bias really soon after passing your driving test, or even just being a learner. So I think it would be great if we could recognize that as individuals, that, yeah, actually, maybe I am not good enough and that's why I shouldn't be doing it. But I think it's unlikely. I think there's too many psychological mechanisms at play there, and that therefore we need to find ways to make people realize that their ability to focus and their ability to pay attention is the issue. It's nothing to do with their driving ability. You know, if their test standard, they've passed their test, then we can assume a certain level of driving ability. We're not questioning that. We're simply saying this isn't how your brain works. And that's why I think we need those kind of creative ins to explain that, but to do it in a non-judgmental way. As soon as you start wagging your fingers at people and saying, no, don't do this because it's bad, they switch off. You've lost them because the self-enhancement bias shield comes straight back up.
So I'm not going to name names, but I did see a video on social media recently with someone talking about how they used to use a mobile phone while they were driving and they never had a problem and it was all hunky-dory, and they feel that most people could use a mobile phone while driving. It's just, I think the phrase was, it's been spoiled by a few. How can we get across to that person that they probably were lucky in those situations to use a mobile phone rather than anything else? How can we reach those people with that mindset?
I think my argument is the way to do that is with evidence-based education. Because the issue there is, and I hear this all the time, I use my phone all the time. I've never been in a collision. I've never had a problem. The issue is every journey completed seemingly without event reinforces to your above average driver that everything's fine, that they can cope, that they can indeed divide their attention, despite the fact that that's not how your brain works, that, you know, everything is fine. What they don't realize is how unaware they are. It's the illusion of awareness. They are unaware of how unaware they are. And therefore, they haven't noticed other road users changing their behavior to mitigate for their perhaps slightly dodgy driving. They haven't noticed that pedestrians are a bit wary of stepping out and crossing the road when, you know, they're stopped in traffic and they're looking up and down at their mobile device. So it's that illusion of awareness, and we can demonstrate that in the lab. We can demonstrate that with research in hands-free mobile phone use, where we can show you can have both hands on the steering wheel, you can have both eyes looking at the road ahead of you. But if you are cognitively distracted, you will fail to see things that are physically in front of you. And therefore, that's how we need to cut through that argument.
Might be a question you can't answer this actually, but how do we reach more people? Because with that, we either need to speak to people kind of individually almost, or reach out to them and say, here's this evidence. So is it just a case of getting more things in front of them on social media and you know, is there anything else we could do other than that?
I think we need a multi-pronged approach, and this is what I've based a career on. So we need stuff on TV. We need to normalize it in the TV programs that we show, not just those that are on the topic of this, but anything that shows people driving and dual tasking behind the wheel. You know, it's changing those social norms. But yeah, it's sharing those research findings in whatever media possible. Yes, we can do more on social media, but then you need to think about particular demographics. You know, I've got teenage kids, they don't go near Facebook. There's no point me launching a Facebook campaign and talking about the dangers of hands-free phone use. I need to be creative and I need to think how to get to those different audiences. But I think it's all about a change in the social norm and social acceptability. And I think in the same way that it's really taboo and socially unacceptable to drink drive, and I don't think you get a lot of pushback from many drivers on that, we need to get there with phone use because it simply is nowhere near. Even though one form of the behaviour is illegal, it's everyone does it. It's not a real problem. It's not a big deal. So we need to keep chipping away at that to change that kind of public perception.
Do you think this is a harder perception to change, though? Because I can remember back 20 years being in the pub with people that would say, I'm only having two. It's okay to drive. Whereas now, I don't seem to hear people say that anymore. No one seems to have one, and not no one, but I don't know anyone that seems to have even just one and drive. It seems to be, if I'm driving, I'm not having any. But there doesn't seem to be that same approach towards mobile phones. Do you think this is a harder problem to tackle?
It potentially is. There's obvious parallels in terms of the effect on your driving to drink driving and distracted driving. But the difference, of course, is it's really easy to measure when you're intoxicated, right? You can get pulled over, you can be breathalyzed. Categorically, you are over the drink drive limit, your driving is impaired, you know, that's it, end of. It's really difficult to demonstrate to people in the same way the level of their distraction, because their distraction will kind of wax and wane throughout the driving task, dependent on the whatever it is they're doing, whether they're texting or having a conversation. And that's why the response is, well, where's the harm? It's a quick text. It's a quick phone call. It's a quick check-in at home. What's the bother? And then, of course, you've got the parallels with conversation with a passenger or being distracted by a passenger within the vehicle. And people say, well, what's the big deal about hands-free phone use? This is PC gone mad. If you're going to ban this, are you going to ban passengers now? And again, this is where research can make clear the difference between these different types of distractors and demonstrate that it really is a problem. But yeah, it's a really difficult thing to solve.
And we'll be back with more from Gemma Briggs in just a moment. I want to give a shout out to some of the latest sign-ups to the Instructor Podcast Premium, and they are Natasha Deacon, Vicky Weston, David Housley, Richard, and Sean Patrick. Signing up, these guys are getting access to over 75 hours worth of exclusive content. And one such piece of content featured Stuart Lockery, where we did a deep dive into all things coaching and mindset, and even took a deeper look at his professional qualification. And of course, Stuart Lockery and Bright Coaching are sponsors of Season 7. And if you would like to find out more, head over to www.brightcoaching.net. Or if you would like to sign up to Instructor Podcast Premium and become an even better driving instructor, then head over to www.theinstructorpodcast.com, or you can find links for all this in the show notes. But for now, let's get back into the episode. I mean, I want to come back to the hands-free stuff in a moment because I find that fascinating. I really do. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm getting myself off topic now because I think this is where instructors can be more involved, because I think instructors are getting an awful lot better at having these conversations in car. I give the example of me before. When I see a student get distracted by something else, I say this could apply to a phone as well. And, there are other examples of that. But I think that we can do an awful lot more with our social media presence. Now, obviously, not all of us have got massive followings like some social media, some instructors do, but I can't help but think, imagine if 30,000 driving instructors were all sharing this message on a sort of semi-regular basis. That's going to reach a lot of people. So, I'm not asking you to tell us what to do, but do you think that is something we can get more involved in? So we're socially campaigning rather than just having those one-on-one conversations?
Yeah, I think that's so important and could be really valuable. And if you can share resources via that enable people to experience their own distraction for themselves, and that hopefully stop young novice drivers from adopting problematic phone use whilst driving before they've started, that's half the battle won, because of course it's really difficult to change behaviour once it's ingrained. And that's why if we can get particularly a young demographic of drivers to understand the dangers and either not start the behaviour in the first place or very quickly knock it on the head, then it can make such a difference, because it, like I say, undoing behaviour is much harder. And those young drivers are still in that kind of neural developmental stage where their prefrontal cortex is still forging all of these connections. And if we can make those connections the right ones, it's so much easier for everyone. So absolutely, sharing anything far and wide could make a huge difference.
I mean, I'll take this opportunity to reach out to instructors listening, because I think we're in a really privileged position now where there's so many apps out there that we use, like diary management apps. And I don't know if all of them do, but I know a lot of them do. They have like resource sections where we can put resources on there. And on mine, I've got all these different, road safety campaigns and stuff. And I know not everyone is going to listen or watch or read them, but I can't shake off this feeling that if one person does, if I could get one person or one person's parents to change their opinion or mindset because of that, well, that's one person I'm impacting. And as I said before, imagine if 30,000 people doing that. That's going to make a significant difference. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. And that is exactly my mantra. I go around, I give loads of talks on my research and on the application of my research. And I say exactly the same thing. I'm not going to convince everyone in any single room to believe my research, to believe the research finding, even though, they're scientifically grounded. I'm not going to convince everyone all of the time. But if I can convince just one person each time I do a talk, hopefully more, but just one, and get the conversation going, then we're winning, because that's the way we change attitudes.
Well, there is still some people that believe in the flat earth, so, whatever. But you are 100% right, though, because I first came across you at the ICE live event. I think you did a virtual thing. I think you were poorly, but either way, that was there. And it was, obviously, I've heard of distracted driving and I knew not to use your mobile phone, but it was seeing that was like, wow, I didn't realize all this stuff. And some of the snippets you've dropped today and knowledge bombs, if you like, that you said at the time, it changed my mindset. I made me realize I need to put more emphasis on this in lessons, on social media, talking to parents and this kind of stuff. And one of the things that stuck out to me, and you kind of touched on it before, was hands-free, and how there's virtually no difference between using a hands-free device and using a mobile. So obviously the big difference is you should be using a hand if you're with mobile. But I suppose in terms of the cognitive functions, there's no difference. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So all of my research is on hands-free mobile phone use, which of course is perfectly legal. So there's loads of research in this area. There was loads of existing research in this area before I even started looking at it. And we know collectively from that research that if you use a phone whilst driving, handheld or hands-free, you're 4 times more likely to be involved in a collision. That effect can last for up to 5 minutes after you've ended your phone use. So that's the cognitive distraction. Some of my own research has shown that if you are using a phone, again, handheld or hands-free, you're far less likely to notice hazards. And if you don't notice them, you don't react to them, which can explain your increased collision risk, probably.
Yeah.
Those hazards that distracted drivers do notice, they take significantly long to react to, which means they hit the brakes later, which means far longer stopping distances. And again, worse potential outcomes for all involved. And we also know that if you're using a phone hands-free, your situational awareness is massively depleted. So you're looking around the scene far less. We know that from lots of eye tracking stuff. I've done lots of eye tracking stuff myself. But also your kind of mental model of that driving situation isn't being updated. So you're not keeping track of what's going on behind you. You're looking in your mirrors. You're not using your indicators. If we were to freeze frame that driving situation, say, what colour is the car behind you? You'd probably have absolutely no idea whether or not there was a car behind you. So all of these things come together to create a real problem. So there is, in terms of the distraction that it imposes and how it affects your driving, there is no benefit in using a hands-free system compared to using a handheld device. It's just that one form is illegal and the other isn't.
So, playing devil's advocate, what's the difference between using hands-free and talking to someone in passenger seat?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a perfectly logical question. The difference is it's shared environment. So if you've got a passenger in the car with you, they can see what you can see. They can regulate how much of a demand they're making on your attention. So they can stop talking if they can see that you're facing something a bit challenging. They can also help you out. Have you seen this guy coming up on your outside? And so someone on the phone doesn't have the benefit of that shared environment. So will consistently demand your attention, even if you need that attention for a particular challenging driving situation. So that's one thing. That's the key difference. But some of my own research has looked into, well, specifically why? Why is that? Like, what is it that's different about talking to someone who isn't physically present, other than them not being able to see what you can see? And some research that I did with Graham Hole at the University of Sussex looked into this. And we found that there's a natural tendency to create images in your mind when you talk to someone who's not physically present with you. So you might picture where they are, what they're up to, what they're describing. And it turns out that brain areas and the cognitive attentional resources needed to create those mental images are the same cognitive resources and brain areas needed for accurate visual perception of that driving scene. So what happens essentially is you've got a competition for shared brain areas and shared cognitive resources. And as with most competitions, if one side wins, then those resources and that focus is taken. So if the phone conversation wins the resources, the driving performance deteriorates in all the ways that we talked about. And vice versa. You could zone out of your phone conversation and your driving performance could remain constant. But that doesn't tend to happen because people seem to be unwilling to let that phone conversation drop. So it seems that the issue with a hands-free phone conversation is that it has a visual component to it, even though you don't think it is. It does. And so that's why both eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel, doesn't mean that you're actually seeing what's in front of you. And we know that from some of our other research where we've demonstrated what's called inattentional blindness, looking but failing to see.
So I'm not meaning to trivialize one, but do you think that the cognitive functions there and the picture in different scenarios is potentially a bigger danger than holding a phone in your hand?
Potentially. I mean, I guess the issue with handheld mobile phone is you've got visual distraction as well. So I always say, but the common issue with any type of phone distraction is cognitive distraction. And you can't do anything about that because your brain needs to process that information. If you're texting or doing anything physically holding the phone, you're also potentially taking your eyes away from the road. And you've got manual distraction because you're physically manipulating a phone at the same time. So I wouldn't say it's quite so cut and dry as that. But it's the underlying cognitive distraction that is the core issue. And as I said, that's not going to go away. But I think it's personally really quite worrying that you can have your eyes on the road, be actively feeling like you're paying attention, actively feeling like you're looking for stuff, yet you fail to see it. And that's demonstrated by all sorts of kind of visual illusions. That's just how your brain works. But you don't experience not seeing something unless you come into my lab. Yeah. And therefore, it's really difficult to kind of communicate that.
We can't send everyone to your lab, can we?
We can't.
I want to touch on that just a little bit more, because the idea of having someone in the car with you and having that conversation, I think that's interesting, because the question I asked you about the difference between talking hands-free and having someone in the car was actually a question my nephew put to me it was after seeing you at the ice-live event, and I found out about the hands-free, and I mentioned it to him, and he was like, well, what's the difference having someone in the car? I'm like, all right, I can't think of a good answer. But that's a perfect opportunity for driving instructors to have those conversations as well, because one of the things that we are trying to do more of now is bring higher levels of the goals driver education into it, which is conversations around how would you handle passengers in your car? And to me, that's a perfect lead into how would you handle the hands-free call? And I think that where you've described that there, that's the way we can bring that in as well. But why is it legal? Why are we allowed to use our hands-free?
That's a really good question. And the answer is, I don't know. That's not entirely fair. I do know. So in 2019, I went and gave evidence to the Transport Select Committee, who held a consultation on mobile phone use by drivers. And they directly quizzed me and a couple of other experts on mobile phone research. And I told them all of the things that we're talking about today and then some. And they wrote a really supportive report saying the government should really consider extending the ban to incorporate hands-free mobile phone use as well, because the evidence is clear. Like I said, there's a lot of evidence. It's not just one or two people who found this. This is, across almost 30 years of research across the world, in labs, on real roads, on simulators, everything. So the reason that it's still legal is demonstrated by the government's response to that report, which was, well, we'd probably like to see a little bit more research because it would be really difficult to enforce. And wouldn't it be inconvenient? Which, is disappointing, but I'm not naive enough to have thought that anything different would happen. It's not been banned because it's a freedom that people have, right? It's something that they enjoy, and taking it away would feel really, problematic. So that's why. And there's also the argument that, of course, law can't keep pace with technology and seemingly with research. They've had 30 years. We've had amendments to the law in that time. There was an amendment to the law after I gave evidence to seemingly close the loophole in terms of what handheld mobile phone use constitutes, which is nice, but, it didn't go far enough. So the reason it's not going to change anytime soon is there's no political will for that to happen, which is a real shame. But what I will say is that there's a lot of goodwill amongst other road safety organisations, roads, fleets, national and international companies who, in the absence of any change to the law, are changing their own policies and saying, look, we're listening to the research, we understand, and therefore our drivers won't be using hands-free devices. So no change to the law yet, but we'll keep trying, and there's different ways of changing behaviours.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that, that certain fleets and companies are taking that approach. It's similar to what a lot of our industry is doing now, in that we look at the DVSA and look at their minimum standards, to quote someone you may or may not know, Chris Spencer, talk about DVSA minimum standards. Well, we don't have to abide by them. We can go above and beyond. We're not just going to teach people so they can get through a test. We do want to teach them so they can drive safely after, including having these discussions. And, it's the whole, I don't want to get too political, but it's the war on motorists thing that I keep hearing, because we've made some roads 20 and, pedestrianised certain aspects of city centres, but let's not go too far down that road today. Do you think we'll ever see handheld phone use banned? Or do you reckon we'll probably just get to a point where all cars are automated before we even reach that point?
In the absence of any massive change in political will, I don't see how it will change anytime soon. There's also, of course, the fact that technology sells cars, right? You look at any advert from any car manufacturer, I guarantee you the tech that is in the car is listed top or at least second. So it's sold to consumers. People like it because they think it's safe, because the law tells them it's safe and that it's acceptable. And car manufacturers want to keep doing that. And you could argue, there's money to be made, and that money goes into our economy. And of course, that's going to feed into whether or not there's political will. So I don't see any change anytime soon. What we do need is a massive shift in terms of an understanding and a recognition of the importance of road safety. Because, and we haven't touched on this quite yet, but I'm sure you have with other speakers, 5 people die every day on UK roads, and around, I think it's 80 are seriously injured or seriously injured. And it costs millions upon millions to the economy. And that's without even considering the hugely most important cost to human life and emotion and all the ripple effects that happens. So it's political will in terms of mobile phone use, but it's much broader than that. And it's kind of chipping away at that. That's really crucial, because I often say in talks, if the homicide rate was level with the rate of road death, people would quite rightly be throwing their arms up in dismay and saying, what's going on? We need to change something here. But we seem to have this kind of level of acceptability. There's an inevitability about the number of people that can die or be seriously injured on our roads. And therefore, accidents happen. And you'll know from, I'm sure, for you and for other of your guests, you won't find many road safety professionals using the word accident. Certainly not when you're discussing things like drink driving, mobile phone use by driving, anything like that. So it all compounds and it all comes together, and it's hugely frustrating. You can hear the frustration in my voice, and I'm sure you share the frustration. But yeah, there would be a massive win if we could change something in relation to legislation. But in the absence of that, we at least need a recognition that more needs to be done on the whole in terms of road safety.
I mean, one of the little taglines I've always used around this podcast is provide information and inspiration. And it's listening to people like yourself talk with that level of frustration and passion that makes me more and more engaged and makes me want to do more. And do you think it falls upon us, as in you and driving instructors and the other people campaigning, the likes of Road Peace and Break and Project Edward, do you think it falls on us almost to go, right, if there is no political will, we need to do more?
Absolutely. Certainly as a researcher, that's how I feel. The whole reason why I do the research that I do is to make a difference. It isn't to publish academic papers and say, oh, aren't I clever? It's to change policy and practice. And every member of the road safety community that I've worked with in whatever role they're in, I think feels the same. So yes, in the absence of any legal directive, yes, that's exactly what we need to do. It shouldn't just be our responsibility, but it seemingly is. And so, yeah, we just need to keep going. But we also need to be, as I said, really creative about how we do it. It needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be non-judgmental. It needs to show recognition that everyone is part of the problem. If you're a driver and you're engaging in this behaviour, you are part of the problem. And take a risk and find out for yourself how you're part of the problem. Take one of our interactive activities and learn that your brain doesn't work that way. Educate yourself. And then that is how we change behaviours, I think. I don't think we change behaviours by whacking up cameras to catch people using their handheld devices and then sending them on their merry way and saying, use hands-free in future. That's not how we solve a massive problem of road safety.
You mentioned non-judgmental there. And that caught my attention because I think it's really difficult to be non-judgmental with some of this stuff, especially if someone is using a mobile phone, because I think everyone deep down knows they shouldn't be using a mobile phone. So we'll kind of put hands-free to the side for a second. I think everyone knows they shouldn't be. So I find it real difficult to be non-judgmental because I'm thinking you could kill someone. You're taking part in an action that is going to make it 4 times more likely you're going to be involved in a collision. But I think you're right. I think we do need to stay non-judgmental because everyone's on a different path. It's taken me being in the instructor industry 7 years before I've started reaching out more to the road safety sector. So I can't look at someone who's not at that stage yet. But what I can do is I can be non-judgmental of that person. I can share what you're giving me today. I can share the other resources. So, I kind of want to touch on that a little bit more. How important is it that even in those difficult situations, as I mentioned, that we remain non-judgmental?
I do think it's really important, and I'm not saying it's easy.
Mm-hmm.
I share the same frustrations as you, but I think in terms of mobile phone research, as you said yourself, until you saw a particular talk that I'd given or you heard particular information elsewhere, you didn't know certain stuff, right? And it was a bit of a revelation. Well, hang on, how can this be a problem? And then you mentioned it to someone else, and they say, "Well, yeah, but what about this?" We have to understand that that's how the majority of people think, because if they haven't been told any different, how can they be expected to know any different? And so that's my approach. That's why I think the non-judgmental approach is best, because we can objectively supply information and say, try this out, experience this for yourself. Let's talk about how your brain works. Let's not judge your driving ability. I don't care how many times it took you to pass your driving test. I'm talking about how your brain works. It's separating those two things out. And in my experience, if you do that, you're far more likely to convince people. Whereas if you go in with a tut, 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 you shouldn't be doing that. You could kill someone. You've got the psychological barriers. You've got crash risk optimism, which, these drivers who suffer from self-enhancement bias also think, well, because I'm above average driver, if I'm involved in a crash, it will be caused by one of those other less competent drivers. So I don't need to change anything about my behavior, because if I crash, they're crashing into me, not vice versa. And so simply saying to someone, well, don't do that because you might crash, you're 4 times more likely to crash. You can almost see the eye rolls as you present that information. Because of course that won't happen every single time they use their phone. So yeah, I think we all have a responsibility to approach it in that kind of objective, non-judgmental way. And I hope that's the way of achieving what we want to achieve.
I think so. But I do want to touch back because a little bit earlier on we spoke a little bit about multitasking, and I want to ask you about this a little bit because a definition I heard of multitasking a while ago that's always stuck with me is multitasking is doing 2 things at the same time badly. So just talk to me a little bit about multitasking, because I think that people don't, it's the old joke about blokes. Women can multitask, blokes can't. Is it the idea that you can't multitask, it's doing 2 things badly, or can some people multitask better than others? Or
well, the idea of multitasking is something of a myth. And this comes down to kind of subjective experience and then what's actually going on in your brain. So we all have this conceptual awareness, this understanding of what multitasking is. Like you said, doing 2 things at once, usually doing them badly. That's absolutely right. If you try and do 2 things at once, your performance in both tasks tends to be worse than if you did them individually. But actually, when we look at how we apply our attention, we're not doing those 2 things exactly at the same time. We can't divide our attention in the same way that a computer can divide the processing power. You can tell I'm not an IT person. We don't have separate beams of attention, if you like, that one focuses on driving and one focuses on a phone conversation. Instead, we shift our attention continually back and forth between the 2 tasks. We're not necessarily aware of that because our brains fill in gaps for us. That's how visual perception and attention works every day, irrespective of whether we're driving or walking down the street or watching TV. Our brains fill in gaps for us all the time. The problem is when you shift between those tasks, there's this lag, this resumption lag, in which you're not really taking in information. And again, you're not aware because your brain fills in the gaps. And in most situations, it doesn't matter. But in a situation where you're driving a couple of tons of metal, potentially at 70 miles on a motorway, 70 miles an hour on a motorway, and someone pulls out in front of you, split seconds matter. So we're all told that we can and that we should multitask because we need to keep on, get stuff done. But that's not actually how our brains work. We shift.
It's fascinating because I experience it a lot doing these podcasts because 90% of my attention is on you. However, every now and again, I'll make a note or I'll glance at my notes on the screen and I'll notice sometimes a change in pitch in your voice, whatever the guess is, a change in pitch, and it draws my attention back because it's something different. It's like, oh, what have I missed? And if I think of driving like that, well, that's too late. If my attention is distracted and then I hear something or see something caught my eye, I then have to look at it and then assess it and then act. And that 2 seconds could be the difference between not just a collision, but a fatal collision and nothing. So I don't know, I find the whole thing frustrating, like you mentioned, but also, weirdly fascinating.
It is. Visual perception is, I obviously think it's fascinating, but it really is when you delve deeper into just how amazing our brains are and how they actually save us from a lot of issues on a moment-to-moment basis. We're unaware of what's going on around us a lot of the time. But yeah, in these high-stakes situations, we can come unstuck.
You spoke there about like the way we look and the way we see. So talk to me a little bit more about that because I always forget the terminology for it. I'll be honest with that. But there's the eye jumps, doesn't it, as you look? And anyway, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let you take this away.
No, you're exactly right. So your eye movements made up of a series of saccades. They're the jumps and fixations, the point at which your eye pauses and takes in some information, or we think it takes in some information. So in terms of driving, distracted drivers make fewer visual fixations. They look around the scene far, far less. And we know that because we do stuff in the lab where we put mobile eye trackers on our participants while they drive a simulator. So some of my own research has shown that distracted drivers look at an area of the driving scene around 4 times smaller than undistracted drivers. They're really bad at looking at the peripheral areas, the areas to the side of the driving scene, the kind of areas where, someone might be stepping off a pavement or a car might be joining from a side street into your stream of traffic. They're really bad for noticing those kind of things. And they tend to focus their visual attention in a highly concentrated, compressed area just above their bonnet. And we call this cognitive tunneling. They're really just focusing in this highly concentrated area. But more worryingly is if we put a hazard right where their eyes are pointing. We know their eyes are pointing there because we've got the eye tracker on them. We put a hazard right there. They're looking directly at it. Very often they won't see it and they won't react to it. And you say to them afterwards, did you see that, granny step off, walk in front, stand in front of your car, shriek? No, didn't see it. So, and this is inattentional blindness. And it's been demonstrated in many different labs, not just mine. And it's a real problem for distracted drivers. They can look at a hazard but fail to see it. And they don't see it because it hasn't reached their perceptual awareness. Their eyes have taken that information in, but they've not done anything more. The brain hasn't done anything more with it. It's just gone and it's lost. And when you play that back to participants, they cannot believe that they haven't seen it. So we use this in research to explain cognitive distraction, but that phenomenon can be really nice as a demonstration for why you shouldn't use your phone, because it doesn't have to be in a simulator with an eye tracker on. We've got little nifty animations, we've got interactive activities that people can try out for themselves in like 60 seconds, have the experience of looking and not seeing, and hopefully think, okay, that might happen to me.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's fascinating. It's how we get over that, isn't it? It's that I did an online course recently about helping Asian drivers, and one of the things I spoke about there was triggers. So, is there anything that surprises them while they're driving? And I still use that now because I'm human. I make mistakes, and if I notice something that surprises me a little bit when I'm driving, it's like, right, my attention's got lost somewhere. Do you think that's a message we can get across as well? That if you find that something surprised you while you're driving, it probably means we've got distracted somewhere.
Yeah, it could be. That's really interesting. I've not really thought about it in those terms at all before. But yeah, certainly in terms of directing your visual attention and how that could impact, I think there's a study there.
There you go. I'll take full credit for that in 6 years' time when something's been found out. I mean, the thing for me with that is I drove back from Newcastle the other day, Newcastle to Bradford. It's about a 2.5 hour drive. And the person I was talking to said they'd probably drive it in one, which is completely fine, you know. But for me, it's like, I know I'm going to need a break in that because I'll get bored. And that's where I get distracted. I don't tend to get distracted by the music or by, other stuff around, but I know that for an hour of driving, I'm like, oh, I'm fed up now. I want to go home. And that's where I feel that I get distracted by the boredom. So there's all kinds of different distractions. But anyway, I'm coming off topic because the thing I wanted to mention there, and I just wanted to emphasize this, all the stuff you've spoken about today is scientifically proven. It's not someone looking down the road and seeing that there's no curvature, so assuming the earth is flat. It's scientifically proven, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's all peer-reviewed, published, empirically based research. Yeah.
I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you this, actually. Peer-reviewed. I hear that phrase a lot. Define what it means to me, peer-reviewed.
It means it's been reviewed by people who are experts in the field. They're your peers. So other academics at other institutions across the globe can be called upon to review any paper that someone submits for publication. So I do it, and it's all done anonymously. So you're asked, will you review this paper? It's in an area of your expertise. You read it, you provide feedback, and they generally have 2, sometimes 3 peer reviewers for each paper. Some of them can be really harsh because it's all anonymous. But it's really important because it's all about academic rigor, because it could be that I've designed a study and want to publish it and I've missed something, or I've, not understood something, or I've made some kind of error. And other people who are experts who I might not know can come along and say, hang on, have you thought about this? And that's so every single paper that's published in any scientific journal goes through that process. So if it's reached that publication level, it's usually a good sign that work is pretty robust.
I mean, I kind of guessed it was reviewed by your peers, but I didn't know all the stuff behind it, so I'm glad I've asked now. One more question around this sort of area then. And as driving instructors, is there like a specific message that you want us to get across to our learners? Because there are times we'll be sat at the side of the road with them for a long period. We'll have those long discussions, but it can be difficult sometimes to get across everything. So, is there one sort of message you'd like us to get across more than other?
I think it's obviously, for me, it's going to be any type of phone use is a massive problem. Just don't do it. It's just the approach of that conversation that's tricky, as we've talked about. I guess there's of course leading by example. So as an instructor, not using your phone yourself, which I'm sure very few people would do anyway. But maybe even going so far as, I'm not going to show you how to set up Bluetooth because you shouldn't be doing it. All of those kind of things. It's kind of normalizing that once you're in the vehicle, that phone is either off, which is probably unrealistic, or at least on silent or out of reach, and that it's completely appropriate and normal that you don't engage with that phone in that time.
No, it's interesting you say that because I do that, but I think that's the norm for me. I think I get in the car and it's like on driving mode, so I can listen to a podcast, but there's nothing coming through. And I naturally do that with my students because it's my norm. But I bet there's people out there that don't do that and they do use hands-free. So maybe they could start actually doing that. Maybe it's something I can put a bit more effort into as well. But yeah, I appreciate that. Do you want to take a moment to tell people where they can find you or anything you might have to offer or anything like that?
Yeah, if you'd like to see any of the resources, you can follow the links for the Open University. If you search for me, Gemma Briggs, there's a website with loads of my resources on. There's stuff on Open Learn as well that you can try out, little nifty interactives and animations and things. But I'm always really happy to just hear from people. So if people want to get in touch, please do.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate that. I'll put all those links in the show notes as well. But big thank you for your time today. I've really found it fascinating. So yeah, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for having me.
So a big thank you to Professor Gemma Briggs for joining me there. I'm sure if anything like me, you'll have taken a load from that. There's loads of information, loads of resources, loads of inspiration again. But there's one extra thing I'm going to throw your way. There was some really useful bits of information in that recording. So what I will be doing over the next few days is clipping it down into a smaller bite-sized episode that you can share with your learners or your learners' parents or friends and family or whatever. Because I think there was a lot of stuff in there that was, aimed directly at driving instructors. So I'm going to trim it down a little bit to send out as that episode or that resource that we can share with other people that doesn't have the driving instructor take on it. So I will update with that. And the best way to keep updated with that sort of stuff is to either sign up to the Instructor Podcast newsletter, which you can find links in the show notes, or head over to www.theinstructorpodcast.com. Or you can even follow the Instructor Podcast on WhatsApp. Go to the channels and search for the Instructor Podcast. Or again, you can find links in the show notes or www.theinstructorpodcast.com. Also want to take a minute to thank Bright Coaching and in particular Stuart Lockery for sponsoring Season 7. I know how seriously Stuart takes this stuff and he's getting it into all his courses at Bright Coaching as well. So if you would like to find out more from Bright Coaching, including about their professional diploma, head over to brightcoaching.net and make sure you're signed up to their newsletter as well as the Instructor Podcast newsletter, and you will find out everything they have to offer over there. But for now, let's just keep raising standards.
The Instructor Podcast with Terry Cook, talking with leaders, innovators, experts and game changers about what drives them.
You're still listening? Well, I may as well take this opportunity to ask, are you listening to this when you were driving? Is the first question that I asked Gemma Briggs. Do you listen to it when you're driving? Does it distract you? Do you get to pay full attention? Or are you like me, do you listen to this stuff with your headphones on with a notepad and pen? Whatever works, let me know. Head over to Spotify. There'll be a poll over there and you can tell me just exactly how you listen to this episode.